David Whitmore, a man whose name was synonymous with power and affluence, sat in the back seat of his luxury car, staring blankly at the city lights that blurred past. At 52, David had built an empire that spanned continents. From exclusive real estate to cutting-edge tech ventures, his fingerprints were on every major industry. Yet, as he sipped his glass of scotch, a strange hollowness accompanied him wherever he went. No amount of wealth, no accolades, could fill the silent void. That evening, as the car rolled to a stop outside a well-known high-end restaurant where a charity event was taking place, David felt the weight of routine. The event was predictable: tailored suits, sparkling dresses, empty conversations. As he stepped out, camera flashes exploded around him, capturing yet another night in the life of a tycoon. He offered a practiced smile before disappearing into the lavish interior. The restaurant was buzzing with chatter and laughter. Servers in crisp uniforms weaved through the crowd, balancing trays of delicacies and champagne. It was here, amidst the murmur of indulgence, that David's gaze fell on Stella Reynolds. She was not like the rest. Her uniform was simple, hair neatly tied back, and there was a subtle grace in the way she moved. Stella was a woman in her early 30s, eyes as sharp as they were kind, and a smile that revealed determination despite the weariness behind it. Stella had worked at this restaurant for years. For her, each shift was a battle, not just against the fatigue of long hours, but against a future she desperately hoped would hold something more. She balanced trays with ease, but her eyes occasionally darted to the window, where dreams she hadn't dared to voice lingered. "Excuse me," David said, stopping her as she passed by. His deep voice, commanding yet unexpectedly gentle, made her pause. "Yes, sir," she replied, meeting his eyes for the briefest moment before looking away. Politeness and caution dictated her response. David didn't know why he had stopped her. Perhaps it was the quiet exhaustion mirrored in her face that resonated with him. "Would you mind recommending something off the menu? Something special," he added, his voice carrying a rare trace of warmth. Stella, taken aback by his question, offered a small smile. "The rosemary lamb. Chef's specialty," she said. For a moment, their eyes met, and a flicker of recognition passed between them. Two souls navigating their separate worlds, yet sharing an invisible thread of longing. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, and Stella was called back to the kitchen by the head chef. David watched her go, feeling a strange ache that was both unfamiliar and compelling. The evening wore on, but David's mind lingered on Stella. He knew countless people, business magnates, celebrities, influencers, but her face, lit by the soft glow of the dining hall, stood out. It wasn't just her beauty. It was the quiet resilience he saw beneath the surface. Stella, meanwhile, continued her shift, unaware of the thoughts she had stirred. She had her own struggles to consider, bills to pay, dreams postponed. Yet that fleeting exchange was a reminder that her life was more than just routine, more than just survival. Later that night, as David left the restaurant, he found himself looking back over his shoulder, scanning the crowd one last time for her. It was ridiculous, he thought. He had everything: a reputation, an empire, a life meticulously crafted to the last detail. But in that single evening, amidst the noise of wealth and success, he realized he was searching for something real, something beyond the glittering facade. And somehow, in that modest, resilient server, he felt he had caught a glimpse of it. He stepped into his car, closed the door, and as the city slipped into the rearview mirror, an inexplicable seed of curiosity had been planted. A seed that promised to grow into something life-changing, though he could never have guessed how profound it would become. A few weeks had passed since that night at the restaurant, but for David, the encounter remained vivid. He carried it with him like a delicate secret, one that occasionally surfaced in the quiet moments of his day. The world around him hummed with the urgency of business deals and strategic meetings, but the memory of Stella, her eyes, her brief, earnest smile, would flash before him, disrupting his carefully structured life. Meanwhile, Stella's days were a whirlwind of shifts and exhaustion. She had almost managed to push the memory of that evening out of her mind, labeling it as another moment in her endless sea of duties. But that was before she noticed the changes, small at first, but unmistakable as time went on. Nausea in the early mornings, a fatigue that seemed to sap her strength. The realization dawned on her slowly, and then all at once. She was pregnant. Stella sat on the edge of her narrow bed in her small apartment, the weight of the news pressing on her like an invisible hand. Her mind raced through the implications: her job, the bills, her barely balanced life. And then, the memory of David Whitmore came back to her, a flicker that soon turned into a steady flame of certainty. He was the father. The thought of telling him seemed absurd. He was a man beyond her reach, someone who walked in circles of power and wealth, whose life was a world away from hers. Yet, it was the right thing to do. After a sleepless night, Stella made her decision. She needed to tell him, not for herself, but for the life she now carried. The next day, Stella stood outside Whitmore Towers, a sleek, imposing structure of glass and steel that pierced the sky. She hesitated, clutching her purse with sweaty hands. Security guards glanced at her, their faces impassive. She was seconds away from turning on her heel and walking away when a familiar figure appeared in the lobby: David. He was deep in conversation, his expression serious as he listened to the man beside him. Stella's heart pounded as he turned and their eyes met. For a moment, confusion clouded his face, replaced quickly by surprise and then curiosity. He excused himself from the conversation and walked towards her, each step deliberate. "Stella," he said, voice steady but laced with concern. "What brings you here?" She took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you, David. It's important." David led her to a quieter corner of the lobby, where the bustle of the city was muted by the glass walls. He studied her, noting the nervous way she twisted her hands. "What is it?" he asked, more gently this time. The words lodged in her throat for a moment before she forced them out. "I'm pregnant, David, and it's yours." For a moment, silence engulfed them. David's eyes widened, and he leaned back slightly as if the impact of her words had physically moved him. He opened his mouth, then closed it, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that suddenly gripped him. Shock, disbelief, and, surprisingly, a surge of something he couldn't yet name. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Stella nodded, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." David looked away, past the lobby to the rushing world outside. He was a man used to control, to knowing the answers before the questions even formed. But this was different. This was life in its rawest, most unplanned form. His gaze returned to Stella, taking in the determined set of her jaw, the vulnerability in her eyes. "We need to talk more about this," he said finally. "Come upstairs." As they took the elevator up, the silence between them was palpable. David's mind spun with questions. What would this mean for his meticulously planned life? For Stella, who clearly faced this burden alone until now. The doors opened to David's private office, a room that exuded power and order. Stella took a seat, her hands clenched in her lap, as David sat across from her. He rubbed his temple and met her eyes. "I didn't expect this, but you're not alone in this, Stella. We'll figure it out." Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with skepticism. She knew promises were easy to make, especially in the initial shock. "I don't need anything from you, David," she said softly, eyes cast down. "I just thought you deserved to know." David leaned forward, a spark of determination lighting his features. "It's not just about what you need, Stella. This is about what we need to do for the baby. I'm not going to walk away." For the first time since the news, Stella felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there. The road ahead would be anything but simple. Yet, in this moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. They were in this together, for better or worse. The days following their conversation were filled with an almost surreal sense of purpose for David. For the first time in years, he wasn't consumed by corporate agendas or the relentless pursuit of power. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to Stella and the life that now connected them in a way neither had foreseen. He felt an unfamiliar mix of responsibility and anticipation that both unnerved and anchored him. David's sudden change in demeanor did not go unnoticed at Whitmore Enterprises. His assistant, Emma, a sharp and discreet woman in her late 40s, caught him staring out of the window more often than before, his brow creased in contemplation. "David," Emma said one morning, placing a stack of documents on his desk, "the board meeting is in an hour. You seem distracted." David turned to her, eyes clear but distant. "I'm fine, Emma. Just sorting through some personal matters." Emma nodded, though she knew that when David Whitmore admitted to personal concerns, it was never a small thing. Meanwhile, Stella's life remained rooted in practicality. She still worked her shifts at the restaurant, facing each day with the stoic determination that had always defined her. Yet, the knowledge that her world was changing irrevocably weighed on her. A few co-workers had noticed her quieter demeanor, but Stella deflected questions with a polite smile and a practiced, "just tired." It wasn't long before David took a step he knew would raise eyebrows. One evening, he arrived at the restaurant just as the last customers were finishing their meals. Stella looked up from wiping a table and froze. Dressed in his tailored suit, David seemed out of place among the soft clatter of plates and the hum of conversation. But he was there, and his eyes sought hers without hesitation. "Stella," he said as he approached, his voice low but steady, "do you have a moment?" Murmurs flitted across the room like tiny sparks. The sight of a man like David Whitmore talking to a server was enough to stir intrigue. Stella's heart thudded as she nodded, wiping her hands nervously on her apron before leading him to a quieter corner by the window. "I wanted to check in on you," David said, glancing around and noting the curious glances. "I know this isn't the ideal place, but I didn't want to wait any longer." She sighed, shifting her weight. "I'm fine, David. Working helps keep me grounded." A soft smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I'm glad you're strong, Stella, but I want to help make this easier for you." Before Stella could respond, a familiar voice chimed in. "Everything all right here?" It was Jamie, the restaurant manager, a stocky man with an affable manner but keen eyes. He glanced from Stella to David with thinly veiled curiosity. "Yes, Jamie, everything's fine," Stella replied, trying to keep her tone light. Jamie's eyes lingered on David for a moment longer before he nodded. "Good, just making sure." David straightened, exuding an air of calm authority. "I won't keep you much longer, but we need to discuss what comes next," he said to Stella. His gaze softened. "Dinner at my place tomorrow night? It'll be private, and we can plan together." Stella felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her. She swallowed, the moment feeling almost surreal. "All right," she replied quietly. As David left, the murmurs surged in his wake. Stella could feel Jamie's eyes on her, not with reproach but with a silent question she wasn't ready to answer. The next evening, Stella arrived at David's penthouse, nerves coiled tight in her chest. She had dressed simply, opting for comfort over pretense, though she couldn't ignore the grandeur as she stepped inside. The space was everything she had imagined: sleek, modern, and immaculately curated. But despite its opulence, it felt oddly cold. "Welcome," David greeted, his voice warm but carrying an undercurrent of tension. He led her to the dining room, where a simple but elegant meal was set out. As they sat, the initial silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Finally, David broke it. "I know this isn't easy for you," he began, watching her carefully. "It isn't easy for me either. But we need to decide how we're going to navigate this. For you, for the baby, and for me." Stella met his gaze, searching for any sign of doubt. "I appreciate that, David, but I'm worried that our worlds are too different. People are already talking, and it's only going to get worse." He leaned forward, determination hardening his features. "Let them talk. This isn't about them. This is about what's right. I want to be there, not just financially but in every way. We have to face this together." Before Stella could respond, David's phone buzzed insistently. A name flashed on the screen: Graham Turner, one of his business partners. David silenced the call, his eyes never leaving hers. "That's the thing," Stella whispered, half to herself. "You're going to have to choose, David. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to watch what that choice might cost you." David's jaw tightened. He reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. I'm already choosing, Stella. I'm choosing us. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back. For the first time, she dared to believe him, even if only for a moment. The news of David's association with Stella traveled faster than he anticipated. Within days, whispers had turned into open discussions, and private smirks had become pointed stares. At first, Stella felt the impact only subtly, co-workers casting curious glances her way, customers pausing their conversations when she approached their tables. But as the days passed, the silence became sharp and heavy, cutting into her like a blade. David, on the other hand, faced a different kind of scrutiny. At Whitmore Enterprises, the atmosphere shifted. Board members, accustomed to discussing mergers and profits, now found themselves murmuring about their CEO's private life. The gossip infiltrated every corner, from the executive lounge to the staff cafeteria. It was not the association with a working-class woman that shocked them, but the perceived risk that it posed to David's carefully cultivated image. The tension finally erupted during a high-profile luncheon at an exclusive club David attended, more out of obligation than desire, with Graham Turner, his most critical partner, leading the conversation. As the waitstaff poured wine and the room buzzed with idle chatter, Graham leaned back in his chair and fixed David with a penetrating stare. "I'll get straight to the point, David," Graham said, swirling the liquid in his glass. "We've heard the rumors. This involvement with the girl from the restaurant, it's not just talk anymore. People are concerned." David's jaw clenched, but he maintained a composed exterior. "I didn't know my personal life required a board vote," he replied dryly. Graham's smile was thin, devoid of warmth. "It doesn't, until it affects business. Investors talk. Reputations matter. This could jeopardize deals that hinge on public perception." The other men at the table nodded subtly, their eyes betraying agreement. David's gaze swept over them, men he had known for years, men who had witnessed his rise to power and now doubted his judgment. "If anyone believes my capacity as a leader is diminished because I choose to stand by someone I care about, then they're underestimating me. And they're mistaken." An uncomfortable silence settled over the table, only broken by the shifting of chairs and coughs that sought to fill the void. But the statement had been made, and it hung in the air, daring anyone to challenge it. Meanwhile, Stella's world continued to tighten around her. The restaurant, once a place where she found a modicum of peace, became a stage for scrutiny. Jamie, the manager, began to assign her the less desirable shifts, a silent way of expressing his unease with the unwanted attention she had attracted. One evening, as she pushed through the last hours of a grueling shift, Stella overheard two servers at the end of the counter whispering. "Can you believe she's still working here?" one of them said, a young woman with too much makeup and a penchant for gossip. "Dating a man like Whitmore and still acting like she's one of us. Maybe she's milking it for what it's worth," the other muttered, shaking his head with a laugh. Stella felt her face burn with a mix of anger and shame. She turned away, biting her lip to keep tears at bay. It wasn't just their words that stung, but the echo of her own fears that she was, in fact, out of place. A few hours later, when the restaurant had emptied and the lights were dimmed, David appeared at the entrance. Stella, still cleaning up, looked up in surprise. He walked toward her, his presence both comforting and complicated. "Hey," he said softly, glancing around at the empty space. "I needed to see you." She put down the cloth she was holding. "David, people are talking. Everywhere I go, I feel their eyes on me. It's only going to get worse." He stepped closer, his expression hardening at her words. "I know, but we'll face it together." "Will we?" she asked, voice trembling with a mix of frustration and doubt. "Because right now, I feel like I'm facing it alone." David reached for her hands, their warmth grounding him. "I'm sorry for that, Stella. It's new for me too, but I won't let this pull us apart. You're stronger than you think." The words settled over her, a small shield against the judgment pressing in from all sides. But before she could respond, the jingle of keys interrupted them. Jamie had returned to lock up, and his eyes went wide at the sight of David. "Everything okay here?" Jamie asked, a thin line of disapproval in his voice. "Yes, Jamie," Stella said, mustering her strength. "Everything is fine." David's gaze flickered to Jamie, an unspoken challenge in his eyes. Without another word, he gently squeezed Stella's hand and stepped back, allowing her to finish her work. But before leaving, he turned back one last time. "I'll pick you up after your shift," he said, loud enough for Jamie to hear. Jamie's lips thinned, but he nodded, saying nothing. As David walked out into the night, Stella felt a pulse of defiance surge through her. The world might be watching, whispering, even hoping for them to fail. But with David's promise lingering in the air, she found herself clinging to a small, resilient hope. They would face it together, come what may. The late evening air was cool and carried the scent of rain as David parked his car in front of Stella's apartment building. He stepped out and leaned against the vehicle, gazing up at the cracked bricks and narrow windows. It was a world apart from the polished luxury he inhabited, but tonight, as he stood there waiting, it felt more real than anything he had experienced in years. Stella emerged moments later, her small bag slung over her shoulder. She hesitated at the door before walking toward him, her expression a mix of uncertainty and resolve. The day's weight still clung to her shoulders, but there was a flicker of something more as she approached, an acknowledgement that no matter how fractured the world felt around her, David was still standing there. "Long day?" David asked, his voice soft but steady. She nodded. "Always is." He opened the passenger door for her, and she slid into the car with a murmured thank you. As David got in and started driving, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried the unspoken weight of everything they were navigating. The drive to David's penthouse was brief, but Stella felt the shift as soon as they crossed the threshold. The sleek space was immaculate, the city's lights sprawling out beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows like an endless ocean. It was a stark contrast to her cramped apartment, and for a moment, Stella felt an unwelcome pang of self-consciousness. David seemed to sense it. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, breaking the silence with a gentle offer. "Water's fine," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. He nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with 2 glasses. Handing one to Stella, he took a seat across from her at the marble island, his expression contemplative. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said finally. Stella looked up, her grip tightening on the glass. "And," David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "And I realized I've been so focused on how this affects my world that I haven't really stopped to think about what it's doing to you." Stella blinked, caught off guard by the admission. "David, No," he interrupted gently, but firmly. "I need to say this. You've been carrying so much alone, and I've let that happen. But I don't want you to feel like this is something you have to handle on your own." She set her glass down, her heart tugging at the vulnerability in his voice. "I don't know how not to handle things alone," she admitted. "It's all I've ever known." David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. "Then let me show you how. Let me be here, Stella, for you and for the baby." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she fought them back. It wasn't just his words that moved her. It was the look in his eyes, a sincerity that cut through all her doubts. Their conversation was interrupted by a buzz from David's phone. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening for a moment before he silenced it. Stella caught the tension in his face. "Work?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Something like that," he replied, setting the phone aside. "But it can wait. Tonight is about us." The tenderness of the moment wrapped around them, creating a fragile bubble of safety amidst the chaos of their lives. For the first time in weeks, Stella felt the weight on her chest begin to lift, if only slightly. Over the next few days, David made good on his promise to stand by Stella. He began showing up at her apartment unannounced, bringing groceries, small gifts, or simply his presence. At first, Stella resisted, uncomfortable with the idea of depending on him. But slowly, she started to let her guard down. One evening, David surprised Stella with a visit to the doctor for her prenatal appointment. She had planned to go alone, but when he showed up at her door with a determined look and an armful of baby books, she couldn't say no. As they sat in the waiting room, David was uncharacteristically quiet, his fingers flipping absently through a parenting magazine. Stella watched him, the usually composed and commanding businessman now fidgeting like a nervous father-to-be. "David," she said softly, drawing his attention, "you don't have to do all of this." He set the magazine down and turned to her, his expression serious. "Yes, I do. This baby is as much my responsibility as it is yours. And I want to be here." The doctor called Stella's name, and as she stood, David followed her. Throughout the appointment, he listened intently, asking questions that surprised even Stella. When the ultrasound technician pointed to the screen and explained the shapes and movements, David's eyes lit up with wonder. His voice trailed off as he stared at the tiny flicker of life on the screen. "That's our baby," Stella finished for him, her voice trembling with emotion. As they left the clinic, the world outside seemed quieter, the chaos momentarily subdued by the shared experience. David glanced at Stella, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," he said simply. Stella smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time, she truly believed they could face the road ahead, not as two individuals navigating separate battles, but as a team. The crisp autumn air did little to calm Stella's growing sense of unease. Days had turned into weeks since David had begun immersing himself in her life, and while his presence was comforting, the challenges they faced seemed to multiply. The whispers at work had grown louder, and Stella could no longer ignore the stares of customers who recognized her as the girl involved with David Whitmore. One afternoon, after another grueling shift, Stella returned to her apartment to find David waiting outside, his tall figure leaning casually against the railing. He smiled when he saw her, but she could tell by the tension in his shoulders that something was amiss. "Long day?" he asked, opening the door for her. "Always," she replied with a tired smile. "What's going on?" David followed her inside and hesitated before speaking. "I need to tell you something. It's about the board." Stella turned to face him, her heart sinking. She knew this moment would come. "What did they say?" "They're concerned," David admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "They think my relationship with you is a distraction. Bad for the company's image." The words hung in the air like a lead weight. Stella's chest tightened, her insecurities rushing to the surface. "So what are you going to do?" David stepped closer, his expression resolute. "I already told them. This is my life, Stella, and I won't let anyone dictate it. They can think what they want, but I'm not walking away." Her eyes filled with tears, a mix of gratitude and guilt. "David, I never wanted to complicate your life like this. Maybe it would be easier if I stepped back." "Don't," he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "Don't even think like that. This is hard, yes, but nothing worth having comes easy. We'll get through it together." Before Stella could respond, she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. She winced, clutching her stomach. David's face immediately shifted to concern. "Stella? What's wrong?" "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. Something's not right." Without hesitation, David scooped her into his arms and carried her to the car, his calm exterior masking the panic bubbling beneath. The drive to the hospital felt endless, each minute stretching into eternity. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. At the hospital, Stella was whisked away for evaluation, leaving David in the sterile waiting room, pacing like a caged animal. The minutes dragged on, and every time a nurse or doctor walked by, his heart leapt with the hope of news. Finally, a doctor approached, his expression serious but not grave. "Mr. Whitmore?" David stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "How is she?" "She's stable for now, but she's experiencing preterm labor symptoms. We've administered medication to help slow things down, but she'll need to stay here for observation. Stress is a significant factor. We need her to rest." David nodded, relief mingling with determination. "Thank you. Can I see her?" The doctor gestured toward a room down the hall. "She's resting now, but you can sit with her." David entered the room quietly, his heart clenching at the sight of Stella lying pale and still against the hospital bed. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, and she offered a weak smile. "You scared me," he said softly, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Sorry," she murmured, her voice faint. "Guess I'm not as strong as I thought." "Don't say that," David replied, taking her hand. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. But you can't keep carrying all of this alone. Let me take care of you." Stella closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm scared, David. What if something happens to the baby?" David squeezed her hand, his own fear carefully concealed. "Nothing's going to happen. We're going to do everything we can to make sure you and the baby are okay." Over the next few days, David stayed by Stella's side, refusing to leave the hospital even when his phone buzzed incessantly with work emails and calls. He delegated responsibilities to his team, trusting them to manage the company while he focused on what truly mattered. The media, ever hungry for a story, caught wind of Stella's hospitalization. Paparazzi camped outside the hospital, their cameras flashing whenever David arrived or left. Headlines speculated wildly about the state of their relationship, painting a picture of drama and scandal. Inside the hospital, however, the chaos of the outside world felt distant. David and Stella shared quiet moments, their bond strengthening in the face of uncertainty. David read aloud from parenting books he had bought, and Stella found herself laughing softly at his earnest attempts to understand baby care. One evening, as David sat by her bedside, Stella reached for his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. "For what?" he asked, genuinely curious. "For staying. For fighting for us when it would have been easier to walk away." David looked at her, his eyes filled with conviction. "There was never a choice for me, Stella. You and the baby, you're my family now. And I'll fight for my family every single day." As Stella drifted off to sleep, David sat back in the chair, his heart heavy but hopeful. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but in that quiet room, with the woman he cared for and the promise of the life they were building together, he found a sense of purpose stronger than any deal or acquisition ever could. The hospital room was filled with soft beeping and the hum of fluorescent lights. Stella's strength had slowly returned over the past week, but the doctors remained cautious. She had been advised to stay under observation until the baby reached a safer point in the pregnancy. David never left her side, managing his empire from his phone while sitting vigilantly by her bedside. One late evening, as the rain tapped gently against the windows, Stella stirred awake. A sharp pain radiated through her abdomen, sharper than anything she'd felt before. Her sharp intake of breath startled David, who had been dozing lightly in the chair next to her. "Stella?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. He moved closer, noticing the sheen of sweat on her brow. "It hurts," she whispered, clutching her stomach. David pressed the call button, his voice steady but urgent when a nurse entered. "Something's wrong. She's in pain." The nurse quickly assessed the situation before paging the doctor. Within minutes, the room was a flurry of activity. A doctor arrived, his face calm but focused. "We need to move her to labor and delivery," he said. "The baby's coming early." Stella's eyes widened in fear. "It's too soon," she whispered, gripping David's hand tightly. "What if something happens?" David leaned over her, his hand steady in hers. "You're strong, Stella. Our baby is strong. We'll get through this." The words were confident, but inside, David felt a storm brewing. The possibility of losing either Stella or the baby was unthinkable. He followed closely as they wheeled her into the delivery room, his heart pounding with every step. The delivery room was filled with controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses moved efficiently, their voices calm but precise. David stood at Stella's side, wearing a surgical gown and cap, his hand never leaving hers. He whispered words of encouragement, his voice steady even as his chest tightened with fear. Stella fought through the pain, tears streaming down her face. She had never felt so vulnerable, yet David's presence anchored her. When she thought she couldn't push any longer, his words gave her the strength to continue. "Just a little more, Stella," the doctor said. "You're doing great." With one final effort, a tiny cry pierced the air. Stella's tears turned to relief as the doctor lifted the baby, small and fragile but alive. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, handing the baby to the nurse. Stella collapsed back onto the bed, exhausted but filled with an overwhelming sense of love and relief. David watched as the nurse carefully cleaned and swaddled their son, bringing him over for Stella to hold. When she cradled the baby in her arms, her expression softened with awe. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice trembling. David leaned down, his hand brushing over the baby's tiny head. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The doctor cleared his throat gently, drawing their attention. "He's small, but he's stable. We'll need to keep him in the neonatal intensive care unit for a while, just to ensure he grows stronger." David nodded, his protective instincts kicking in. "Do whatever it takes." As the nurses wheeled the baby to the NICU, Stella looked at David, her eyes filled with worry. "Do you think he'll be okay?" David kissed her forehead, his lips lingering for a moment. "I know he will. He's as strong as his mother." The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Stella was discharged from the hospital, but their son, whom they named Lucas, remained in the NICU. David and Stella visited every day, sitting by the incubator and watching as their tiny baby fought to grow stronger. The hum of machines and the gentle rhythm of Lucas's breathing became the background to their lives. Outside the hospital, the media frenzy escalated. Photos of David and Stella leaving the hospital circulated online, sparking headlines and wild speculation. "Millionaire's miracle baby" and "Scandal or Salvation" were just a few of the articles plastered across tabloids. David ignored them, but Stella struggled with the attention. One afternoon, as they sat beside Lucas's incubator, Stella turned to David. "Do you ever regret this?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, startled by the question. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I've turned your life upside down," she said, her voice trembling. "You've had to fight so much because of me and Lucas. I see the headlines. I hear the whispers." David reached out, taking her hand in his. "Stella, look at him," he said, nodding toward Lucas. "Do you see how hard he's fighting? That's all that matters. You and Lucas are all that matter. The rest of the world can say what they want." Tears welled in Stella's eyes, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. She leaned her head against David's shoulder, feeling the strength in his unwavering commitment. Weeks passed, and slowly, Lucas began to grow stronger. The day finally came when the doctors declared him healthy enough to go home. David and Stella stood in the NICU, holding their son together for the first time without wires or machines attached. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a reminder that their love and resilience had brought them to this point. As they left the hospital, Stella looked at David, her heart full. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked, glancing at her. "For never giving up on us," she replied, holding Lucas close. David smiled, a rare softness in his eyes. "That's what family does." As they stepped into the car, the world outside felt different. The challenges hadn't disappeared, but together, they had weathered the storm. And as they drove home, their son nestled safely in Stella's arms. They knew they were ready for whatever came next. The days at home with Lucas were a mixture of exhaustion and joy. The once sterile and quiet halls of David's penthouse now echoed with soft cries, the shuffle of baby feet against blankets, and Stella's tender murmurs as she cradled their son. For David, it was a transformation. The man who had once thrived in controlled boardrooms now found peace in the chaos of midnight feedings and lullabies. But outside their sanctuary, the world continued its relentless gaze. The press remained hungry for any scrap of scandal, and whispers among David's business partners grew louder. Stella's past, once a private matter, was now public fodder. Articles surfaced detailing her modest upbringing, her years of struggle, and, worst of all, the insinuation that she had manipulated her way into David's life. The first time Stella saw one of the articles, she froze. The headline screamed from the glossy magazine cover, "From Rags to Riches," the real story behind Stella Reynolds. Her hands trembled as she skimmed the text, each word cutting deeper than the last. Words like opportunist, unworthy, and gold digger seemed to leap off the page. When David returned home that evening, he found her sitting on the couch, the magazine still open in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She held up the magazine without a word, her silence heavier than any explanation. David took it, his jaw tightening as he read. He tossed it onto the coffee table with a sharp exhale. "It's garbage," he said firmly. "None of it matters." "It matters to me," Stella whispered, her voice breaking. "People think I'm only here because of your money. They think I don't deserve you or Lucas." David knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me, Stella. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. I know who you are. Lucas will know who you are. That's all that matters." She looked at him, tears pooling in her eyes. "I just want to be enough." "You are more than enough," he said, his voice steady but warm. "And anyone who says otherwise isn't worth your time." The tension between David and his business world reached a boiling point at a charity gala weeks later. The event was meant to raise funds for a hospital renovation, but as always, it doubled as a playground for society's elite. Stella attended reluctantly, knowing that she couldn't avoid public appearances forever. The room glittered with chandeliers and the sparkle of diamonds. Stella, wearing a simple yet elegant gown David had picked for her, moved through the crowd by his side. She felt every stare, every hushed whisper as they passed. David held her hand tightly, a silent message to anyone daring to judge. The confrontation came unexpectedly. Graham Turner, David's longtime partner and critic of his personal choices, approached with a drink in hand. His smile was sharp, his tone dripping with condescension. "David," Graham began, glancing at Stella, "and this must be the infamous Stella. You've certainly become the talk of the town." David's jaw clenched, but Stella spoke before he could. "I suppose that makes me lucky," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Not everyone gets to be so widely discussed." Graham raised an eyebrow, surprised by her composure. "Indeed, though I imagine the attention isn't always flattering." Stella's lips curved into a faint smile. "No, but I've learned that what people think of me says more about them than it does about me." David squeezed her hand, pride gleaming in his eyes. Graham faltered, clearly not expecting her confidence. With a curt nod, he retreated into the crowd. "You handled that perfectly," David whispered, leaning closer. "I've had practice," she replied, though her heart still raced. As the weeks turned into months, Stella worked to reclaim her sense of self. She began volunteering at a community center, helping single mothers navigate the same challenges she had once faced. For the first time, she felt like she had a purpose outside of the roles of mother and partner. David supported her fully, even when it meant adjusting his schedule to spend more time with Lucas. Watching Stella thrive in her new role only deepened his admiration for her. She wasn't just surviving the storm. They both were building something stronger in its aftermath. One afternoon, while Stella was organizing donations at the center, a reporter approached her. At first, she stiffened, expecting another ambush of invasive questions. But the woman's tone was different, gentler, curious rather than probing. "Stella, I'm writing a piece on community outreach, and I heard about the work you're doing here. Would you be open to an interview?" Stella hesitated, glancing at the shelves of donated goods and the women chatting softly nearby. This wasn't about her relationship with David. It was about the life she was creating for herself. "I'll think about it," she said finally. When she told David that evening, he smiled. "You should do it," he said. "Let them see the real you. The person I see every day." Stella agreed, though nerves clung to her. When the article was published weeks later, it painted a picture of resilience and strength. For the first time, the world saw Stella not as a headline but as a person. As she held Lucas one evening, the quiet hum of their home wrapped around her like a warm blanket. David sat beside her, his arm draped over the back of the couch, watching her with a contented smile. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said softly. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of the past months finally beginning to ease. "We're incredible," she corrected, smiling down at Lucas. Together, they had faced the ghosts of the past and emerged stronger. Whatever lay ahead, they were ready to face it, side by side. Life at home settled into a fragile rhythm. The once overwhelming noise of external judgments and media scrutiny faded to a distant hum as Stella and David focused on their growing son, Lucas. Stella found herself rediscovering parts of her identity she thought she'd lost in the whirlwind of change. Her work at the community center gave her purpose, and her evenings with Lucas and David filled her heart in ways she hadn't imagined possible. David, too, was transforming. He had always been driven, his ambition a cornerstone of his identity. But now, he found himself redefining what success meant. The office no longer felt like his sanctuary. Instead, it was the quiet moments at home with Lucas asleep on his chest or Stella laughing at one of his rare jokes that brought him peace. One morning, as David sat in the kitchen sipping coffee, Stella joined him, Lucas balanced on her hip. She placed the baby in his high chair and smiled. "You look deep in thought." David glanced at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "I've been thinking about scaling back at the company." Her eyebrows shot up. "Scaling back? You?" He chuckled softly. "I know. It sounds ridiculous coming from me, but I want to be here more for you. For Lucas. I've spent years chasing deals and power, and I've realized I don't want Lucas to grow up thinking that's all his dad cares about." Stella's smile softened as she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "That means a lot, David. But you don't have to give up everything." "I'm not giving it up," he clarified. "Just reprioritizing. Delegating more. Graham can handle the day-to-day operations." Stella hesitated, remembering Graham's skepticism and their tense interactions at the gala. "Do you think he'll support that?" David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It doesn't matter if he does or not. This isn't about him." Later that week, David called a meeting with the board to discuss his plans. The atmosphere was tense as he outlined his vision for the company's future. A more decentralized leadership structure that would allow him to step back without compromising the firm's success. Predictably, Graham was the first to voice his concerns. "David, this company is your legacy. You built it from the ground up. You can't expect to walk away and not have that affect the brand." David's gaze was steady as he replied, "I'm not walking away. I'm shifting my focus. My priorities have changed, and that doesn't mean I care less about this company. It means I'm choosing to care more about my family." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, David's unwavering determination silenced even his most critical peers. After the meeting, Graham approached him privately. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "Dead serious," David replied. "You've known me a long time, Graham. You know I don't make decisions lightly." Graham sighed, shaking his head with a reluctant smile. "You've changed, David. But maybe that's not a bad thing." Meanwhile, Stella's work at the community center was flourishing. She had taken on a leadership role, organizing programs for single mothers and hosting workshops on financial independence. For the first time in years, she felt like she was contributing to something bigger than herself. One day, while Stella was preparing for a workshop, she noticed a familiar face lingering by the door. It was one of her former co-workers from the restaurant, a young woman named Lily, who had always been kind but shy. "Lily?" Stella called out, waving her in. Lily hesitated before stepping inside. "Hi, Stella. I saw the article about you and everything. It's incredible what you're doing here." Stella smiled warmly. "Thank you. Are you okay? You look a little nervous." Lily bit her lip, her voice low. "I've been struggling lately. I've been thinking about leaving the restaurant, but I don't know where to start." Stella guided her to a seat and listened as Lily shared her fears and dreams. It reminded Stella of herself just months ago. Unsure, overwhelmed, but quietly hopeful. "You can do this," Stella said firmly, "and I'll help you. We'll start with your resume and go from there." Lily's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Stella. I don't know how I can repay you. Just pay it forward someday," Stella replied with a wink. That evening, Stella shared the encounter with David as they prepared dinner together. Lucas sat in his high chair, babbling happily as David stirred a pot of pasta. "You're inspiring people, Stella," David said, glancing at her over his shoulder. "That's not something everyone can do." She laughed softly, setting the table. "It's not just me. I think Lucas has a lot to do with it." David smiled as he set the pot on the counter and turned to her. "Maybe, But Lucas has an incredible mother to thank for that. The simplicity of the moment, a warm kitchen, the smell of dinner, Lucas's giggles, filled Stella with a deep sense of contentment. She hadn't imagined this life for herself, but now that she had it, she couldn't imagine anything else. Later that night, after Lucas had been put to bed, Stella and David sat on the balcony, gazing at the city lights. David's arm was draped over her shoulders, and Stella leaned into him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "I've been thinking," Stella began, her voice soft, "about how far we've come." David looked at her, his expression tender. "And how far we still have to go." She smiled. "Exactly. But for the first time, I feel like we're ready for it." David pressed a kiss to her forehead. "We are." Together. As they sat in the quiet embrace of the night, the challenges they had faced felt distant, replaced by the strength of their bond and the promise of a brighter future. Months passed, and the rhythm of Stella and David's life began to feel like home. Lucas had grown from a fragile infant into a lively toddler, his laughter filling every corner of the penthouse. His bright eyes and curious nature reminded Stella daily of how far they had come. David, once the stern and solitary businessman, had softened, his focus no longer on stock charts and board meetings, but on the tiny boy who clutched his fingers and the woman who held his heart. The world outside their walls, however, hadn't entirely forgotten them. Though the media frenzy had died down, Stella occasionally caught whispers about their past in articles or online forums. Still, the foundation they had built together stood strong, each challenge fortifying their bond rather than weakening it. One crisp autumn afternoon, Stella found herself in the garden of their home, a new property David had purchased away from the bustling city. The space was expansive and filled with golden leaves that danced in the breeze. Lucas toddled ahead of her, giggling as he chased after the family's Labrador, a recent addition to their lives. Stella watched him with a mix of pride and gratitude, marveling at the resilience of the tiny boy who had fought so hard to thrive. David appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist as they both watched Lucas play. "He's fearless," David said, his voice filled with admiration. "He gets that from you," Stella replied, leaning into him. "Or maybe from his mother," David countered with a soft smile. "You've shown him what it means to face the world with courage." That evening, they hosted a small gathering at their home, a stark contrast to the grand galas that had once dominated David's social calendar. Close friends, colleagues, and Stella's co-workers from the community center filled the house with warmth and laughter. As the night progressed, David stood to make a toast. He clinked his glass gently, the room quieting as all eyes turned toward him. "I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for being here tonight," he began, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Stella. "This year has been one of change, unexpected, challenging, but also transformative. And none of it would have been possible without Stella." Stella's cheeks flushed as everyone turned toward her. David smiled, his voice steady with emotion. "She has taught me more about strength, resilience, and love than I thought possible. Together, we've built a life that I'm proud of. Not because of success or wealth, but because of the family we've created." The room erupted in applause, and Stella felt tears sting her eyes as David raised his glass. "To Stella, to Lucas, and to the future we're building together." As the night wound down and guests began to leave, David and Stella found themselves in the quiet living room, Lucas fast asleep upstairs. Stella rested her head on David's shoulder, the flicker of the fireplace casting a soft glow around them. "Did you mean what you said?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every word," David replied, his hand gently tracing patterns on hers. Stella looked up at him, her expression a mix of vulnerability and strength. "Sometimes I still worry that I'm not enough, that I'll never live up to what people expect of me." David cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Stella, you've never had to live up to anyone's expectations but your own. And you've exceeded them every day." Her lips curved into a small smile, and she leaned into his touch. "I never thought my life would look like this," she admitted. "There were so many nights I didn't even dare to dream of something better. But now," David prompted, his voice tender, Now I feel like I found my place, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. With you, with Lucas, I feel whole. David pulled her close, resting his chin atop her head. You've always been whole, Stella. You just needed the chance to see it. In the months that followed, their lives continued to evolve. Stella's work at the community center expanded, earning recognition for the programs she spearheaded. Women from all walks of life found inspiration in her story, and Stella finally began to see herself as more than just someone who had survived. She was someone who thrived. David, true to his word, scaled back his role at the company. He spent more time at home, embracing fatherhood with a dedication that surprised even himself. The once intimidating world of late-night diaper changes and bedtime stories became his refuge. One day, as the three of them walked along a trail near their home, Lucas ran ahead, his tiny legs carrying him toward the edge of a hill. Stella's heart leapt, but David caught her hand and smiled. He's fine, David reassured her. He's exploring. Stella watched Lucas, his arms outstretched as he turned to face the wind, giggling with the pure joy only a child could know. She felt a swell of gratitude, so profound it brought tears to her eyes. David squeezed her hand. What are you thinking? That we did it, Stella said, her voice filled with wonder. We've built something beautiful. David leaned down, kissing her forehead. And this is just the beginning. As Lucas turned and ran back toward them, his laughter ringing out like music, Stella felt a profound sense of peace. The road they had traveled had been filled with challenges, but together, they had faced each one with strength, love, and hope. And for the first time, the future felt limitless. The warm glow of the late summer sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the expansive garden of the Whitmore estate. Laughter echoed through the air as Lucas, now 5 years old, ran across the lawn, his feet bare and his hair tousled by the breeze. In one hand, he clutched a toy airplane, his bright eyes sparkling with the unrestrained joy of childhood. Stella sat on a wooden bench nearby, a book resting in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in some time. Her focus was entirely on Lucas, her heart swelling with pride as she watched him. His boundless energy and fearless curiosity were reminders of the tiny, fragile infant they had once worried might not survive. Now, he was thriving, a testament to the resilience of love and the strength they had built as a family. David emerged from the house, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea. He placed it on the small table beside Stella before sitting down next to her, his arm naturally draping around her shoulders. He followed her gaze to Lucas, who was now lying on the grass, staring at the clouds as if they held the secrets of the universe. Hard to believe he's already 5, David said, his voice soft with wonder. Seems like yesterday we were bringing him home from the hospital. Stella leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. And now he's starting school in the fall, she said, a hint of wistfulness in her tone. It feels too soon. David chuckled. It'll be an adventure for him, and for us. She smiled, though there was a trace of bittersweetness in it. He's growing up so fast. Sometimes I worry I'll blink and he'll be all grown. David turned to her, his expression serious but tender. He's growing up surrounded by love. That's what matters. As the afternoon melted into evening, the 3 of them gathered on the porch for dinner. Lucas, seated between Stella and David, regaled them with an animated story about the adventures of his toy airplane. Stella and David exchanged amused smiles, encouraging his imagination with nods and questions. After Lucas had eaten his fill and his energy began to wane, David carried him upstairs to bed. Stella followed, standing in the doorway as David tucked their son into the covers, his voice low as he told Lucas a bedtime story. The sight of David, once so consumed by his work, now a devoted father, filled Stella with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Once Lucas was asleep, they returned to the porch, the evening air cool and quiet. Stella wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and sat on the porch swing, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood as she gazed out at the stars. It feels surreal sometimes, she admitted, her voice thoughtful. This life, this home, everything we've built. David sat beside her, his hand covering hers. "You built it with me, Stella. Every step of the way." She turned to him, her eyes shimmering. "I used to think I didn't deserve it, that I was just lucky you didn't see through me." David frowned slightly, his hand tightening around hers. "Stella, you've never been anything less than extraordinary. You don't owe this life to luck. You earned it." Her lips curved into a soft smile, though tears glistened in her eyes. Sometimes it feels like a dream I'm afraid to wake up from." David leaned forward, his forehead resting gently against hers. "It's real," he murmured, "and it's ours." The next day brought a rare occasion, a celebration. The community center where Stella worked was hosting a grand opening for a new wing, funded largely by a generous donation from the Whitmore Foundation. It had been Stella's idea, and David had supported it wholeheartedly, knowing how much the center meant to her. The event was bustling with energy as families, volunteers, and community leaders gathered to celebrate the milestone. Stella stood near the entrance, welcoming guests with her characteristic warmth. Lucas clung to her hand, his excitement barely contained as he bounced on the balls of his feet. David arrived shortly after, stopping to shake hands and chat with the attendees. His presence, once intimidating, now felt approachable, a testament to how much he had changed since Stella had first entered his life. When it was time for the speeches, Stella stepped onto the small stage, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She spoke of resilience, of second chances, and of the importance of community. She thanked those who had supported her journey and shared her gratitude for the family who had inspired her every step of the way. As she finished, the crowd erupted into applause, and Stella spotted David's proud smile from the front row. Lucas waved enthusiastically, shouting, "That's my mommy." Stella's cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and joy. She stepped down from the stage, Lucas running to wrap his arms around her legs. "You did amazing," David said as he approached, his voice filled with admiration. "I'm so proud of you." Stella looked up at him, her heart swelling. "I couldn't have done it without you." David shook his head. "You could have, but I'm glad I got to be part of it." That night, as the house settled into silence and Lucas slept soundly upstairs, Stella and David stood together on the balcony, gazing at the city lights in the distance. Stella felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that came from knowing she had fought for her happiness and won. "This is just the beginning," David said, his voice low but filled with conviction. Stella nodded, her eyes shining with hope. "It's a beautiful beginning." As they stood there, the world felt vast but conquerable. Their journey had been marked by challenges and growth, but the love they had nurtured and the family they had built were unshakable. Together, they were ready for whatever came next.